We are not slaves." The words tore through the crystal-lit conference room like a thunderclap. Hiroshi Takeda's voice, low, commanding, edged with fury, echoed off the glass walls. His hand struck the mahogany table, rattling pens and water glasses. Papers fluttered in the sudden gust of his anger. Then, without waiting for an answer, the Japanese billionaire turned sharply, his tailored suit cutting a dark silhouette against the panoramic skyline of Tokyo. He was leaving. The door loomed ahead of him like the edge of a cliff. One more step, and the billion-dollar deal between Japan and the visiting American delegation would shatter into silence. And here is where I must ask you. If a single mistranslated word had the power to destroy years of negotiation, what would you do? Walk away? Stay silent? Or risk everything to speak? Stay with this story, because what happens next will change not only this room, but the way we see those who live in the shadows of power. The air in the room was heavy, thick with humiliation. Nobody had expected Takeda's outburst. To the Americans, most of whom barely understood Japanese, it sounded like a storm of syllables. Foreign, incomprehensible, but undeniably hostile. Faces stiffened. Whispers darted like nervous birds across the table. Someone tried a nervous chuckle, quickly silenced by the billionaire's cold glare as he passed. At the far edge of the room, where the junior staff stood half in shadow, a man shifted uneasily in his chair. His name was Masato Miller, though most just called him Matt. American-born, son of a Japanese mother and American father, a former military veteran who once wore the uniform with pride. Now he wore an ill-fitted suit borrowed for the occasion. Nobody had asked him to speak. Nobody expected him to. His job, officially, was logistics support. In truth, he was invisible. Beside him sat a small girl, no taller than the armrest of her chair. Emmy, his 8-year-old daughter. She clutched a worn notebook to her chest, swinging her legs quietly beneath the table. She wasn't supposed to be here. Children had no place in billion-dollar negotiations. But Matt had no choice. He couldn't afford a babysitter in Tokyo, and Emmy had begged to see the skyscrapers her grandmother once told her about. The Americans had frowned at her presence, but assuming Matt would keep her quiet, they allowed it. To them, he was harmless, forgettable. Across the table, the official interpreter paled, glasses slipping down his nose. He had been the one to twist a delicate phrase into something harsher, turning assured partnership into binding servitude. A slip? Or something more? Nobody cared in that moment. The damage was done. Takeda's steps grew louder, closer to the door. His assistant scrambled after him, whispering frantically. The American's lead negotiator, a sleek man named Richard Cole, raised his voice. "Your Excellency, please. There's been a misunderstanding." But his words fell flat. Takeda didn't even slow. From the corner, Matt lowered his eyes. The sight was achingly familiar. Power storming out, ordinary men left to sweep the wreckage. He knew this rhythm. He had lived it before. Years ago, on Okinawa, one misinterpreted order had cost him his closest friend. A life erased by a misunderstanding. The memory still pulsed like a scar beneath his calm exterior. He looked down at Emmy, her wide eyes reflecting the chandeliers above. She whispered, almost to herself, "Daddy, did they really mean slavery?" Her voice, so small, carried more weight in his chest than the billionaire's thunderous shout. Matt didn't answer. He couldn't. His jaw tightened, but his hand reached for hers. His fingers, rough from years of service, wrapped gently around her smaller ones. A silent vow. Not again. Meanwhile, Richard Cole straightened his tie, his expression caught between panic and calculation. He was no fool. He knew if Takeda left, the deal would collapse, and with it his career. Yet in his eyes flickered something colder, almost satisfied, as if chaos served a deeper plan. Nobody noticed. Not yet. The door creaked under Takeda's hand. The Japanese billionaire paused only long enough to spit one final phrase in his mother tongue. "America insults us." The interpreter froze. The American stared blankly. No one moved to stop him. Except Matt's gaze lifted. Just for an instant, the soldier within him surfaced. Calm and sharp, he saw what the others could not. The precise fracture where dignity had been broken. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Not here. Not yet. But in his silence, something stirred. Emmy's small hand squeezed his, as if she, too, felt the weight of the moment. The room's tension pressed inward, suffocating. Takeda's polished shoes clicked against the marble floor, each step sounding like the toll of a clock counting down the death of opportunity. Somewhere, a pen rolled off the table, clattering to the ground. Nobody picked it up. Nobody breathed. And so, in that fragile heartbeat, with power walking away and dignity bleeding into the floor, the story of a forgotten father and his little girl began. In the moments after Takeda's furious exit, the conference room did not breathe. It was as if the glass walls themselves had absorbed the sound, leaving only silence, sharp and uncomfortable. The American negotiators exchanged glances, their expressions brittle masks of professionalism, while their thoughts spiraled with panic. $1 billion contract was slipping through their fingers, and none of them dared to chase after the man who had just declared their insult. At the farthest end of the room, almost hidden behind a pillar, sat Matt Miller. His chair was smaller, tucked against the wall as though to remind him where he belonged, at the margins. Nobody had introduced him when the delegation arrived. Nobody asked his opinion now. To them, he was support staff, a placeholder for menial work, coffee orders, scheduling transport, carrying boxes. In the hierarchy of power, he was invisible. Matt didn't mind the silence that surrounded him. He had lived with it too long to resist it anymore. Once, years ago, silence was his weapon. On the battlefield, in the still nights of Okinawa, when every sound might cost lives. Now it was different. Silence had become his disguise. In this room of tailored suits and polished shoes, he preferred they forget he was even here. The Americans whispered. Richard Cole leaned over to one of his aides, his voice clipped and urgent. "We'll frame this as a translation error. Buy some time. We can clean it up later." His aide nodded, scribbling in a notebook. No one even glanced at Matt. Matt sat, straight-backed, hands resting on his knees. His eyes didn't wander like the others, didn't search for solutions in panic. They remained fixed on the door where Hiroshi Takeda had vanished. Beneath that stillness lay a current of memory. Okinawa, his closest friend, bleeding out in the dirt, because an order had been twisted by language. The weight of misunderstanding, the cost of silence. Beside him, Emmy shifted. She swung her legs gently, humming under her breath, eyes darting around the gleaming room with innocent curiosity. She had never seen a chandelier this large, or windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. Her presence was jarring here, like a wildflower growing between marble tiles. The executives had given her sharp looks when she walked in, her small hand tucked in her father's. "Children don't belong here," one had muttered under his breath. Another had whispered, "He couldn't even find a babysitter." But Emmy had not noticed the scorn. She sat now, her notebook clutched tight, flipping it open as her father once taught her to do. The pages were filled with characters. Hiragana, katakana, kanji. Some written in Matt's heavy, uneven hand. Others drawn by Emmy in pencil smudges. Between them lay years of evenings, when Matt taught her what he remembered from his time stationed in Japan. For him, it was discipline, remembrance. For her, it was adventure, a secret language she could share with her late grandmother's ghost. The notebook was battered, corners curled, its cover scratched from being carried in Matt's pack during deployments. To the others, it was trash, a relic unworthy of a boardroom. To Matt, it was a symbolic lifeline, the thread tying him to a past that still defined his present. To Emmy, it was treasure. She ran her finger over the kanji for respect, mouthing it silently, as if practicing a prayer. Matt's silence made the executives restless. One of them, a young manager with slicked back hair, sneered in his direction. What's he doing here anyway? Logistics. He should wait outside. Another chuckled softly. Carrying boxes, maybe. Not exactly deal-making material. The words were meant to be whispers, but the acoustics of the glass walls carried them farther than intended. Matt heard every syllable. He did not flinch. Years of military discipline had trained him to absorb insults without breaking. His gaze stayed fixed, his expression unreadable. But Emmy turned her head, her brows knitting, her lips parting as though she might defend him. Matt's hand found hers before she could speak. He gave a small squeeze, subtle, firm, his way of saying, "Not now. Not here." She closed her mouth, but her eyes glistened. The truth was, Matt had once stood in rooms not unlike this one, though they were dustier, noisier, filled not with polished men in suits, but with commanding officers in uniform. Back then, his words mattered. His voice carried orders, strategies, reassurance for frightened young soldiers. But all of that had dissolved after Okinawa. The death of his friend had shattered his faith in systems, in power, in himself. He left the service quietly, taking nothing with him but the notebook and a sense of guilt that never loosened its grip. Now, when he walked into a room like this, people saw only a quiet man with tired eyes, a single father trying to make ends meet, a shadow of what he once was. And Matt let them see that version. It was safer. Invisible men didn't get blamed. Invisible men didn't get noticed. But Emmy noticed. Always. She leaned against his arm now, whispering, "Daddy, did you see how angry he was? Like the stories Grandma used to tell." Matt nodded slightly, eyes still on the door. Was it because of the words? She pressed. He finally glanced at her, his green eyes softening. Words carry weight, little one. Sometimes heavier than stones. She traced the kanji for stone in her notebook, then the one for heart. The contrast made her giggle quietly. Matt smiled faintly, the kind of smile that appeared only for her. From across the table, Richard Cole caught sight of the girl scribbling in her notebook. He frowned. "Who thought it was a good idea to bring a child here?" His voice was low, but sharp enough to sting. No one answered. No one defended Matt. To them, he was furniture, a man too unimportant to explain himself. And still, he remained composed. That was Matt's way. Never rising, never falling, steady as a metronome. It was a quality the military had beaten into him, but it had become his shield in civilian life. People dismissed him, mocked him, underestimated him. He endured it all with the patience of stone. But Emmy wasn't stone. She was fire. Quiet fire, waiting for the right breath of air. Outside, the Tokyo skyline glittered, neon reflections sliding down the glass walls like restless spirits. Inside, the Americans debated damage control. Voices overlapped, excuses formed, strategies collapsed. And still, Matt sat in silence, a man disregarded, a father unseen. He looked at Emmy again, her small hand smudged with pencil graphite, her eyes alight with curiosity. In her, he saw not just innocence, but the possibility of redemption. She was his second chance, not to be a soldier, not to reclaim a lost career, but to live with dignity, to raise someone who might do what he had failed to do. Bridge divides, heal wounds, bring respect into rooms where it had vanished. For now, though, he remained invisible. The forgotten man at the edge of history, the father who carried boxes, the soldier who carried guilt, and the child beside him, leafing through a battered notebook, the kanji for respect, glowing faintly under the chandelier's light, was about to change everything. The interpreter's hand trembled before his voice did. Sweat gathered along his hairline as he adjusted the headset and leaned toward the mic. Pages whispered under his fingers until he found the clause the lawyers had polished. Assured partnership, renewable by mutual consent. He swallowed, glanced from the American side to the Japanese, and spoke. Binding servitude, he said in Japanese. The words struck like shards of glass. A murmur rippled, then collapsed into stillness. The general counsel looked up, unsure she had heard correctly. A junior analyst stared at the table as if the polished wood had turned to water. The phrase was not merely wrong, it pressed a bruise. Hiroshi Takeda did not ask for a paraphrase. The billionaire's mouth tightened by a millimeter, the line between dignity and insult, and the room's temperature fell. He spoke quietly at first, as if testing whether the offense might be a fluke. Repeat your phrase, he said. The interpreter's throat clicked. Binding servitude. A chair leg scraped. A whispered, no, no, died halfway. Richard Cole shot the interpreter a look that could be mistaken for sympathy if one didn't know him. The man with the headset gripped the table, rushed into an explanation, stringing words too quickly. He referenced permanence, obligation, a commitment that binds without exit. Takeda straightened. His assistants went still. Negotiation turned courtroom. He opened his palm and brought it down upon the table. Once, measured, like a judge calling order. We are not slaves, he said, each syllable crisp. The glass walls threw his voice back. Pens rattled. The chandelier chimed. Across the table, the Americans paled, forced to read meaning from posture and tone, from the abrupt scrape of Takeda's chair as he stood. The interpreter tried to recover. Your Excellency, what was meant? What was meant, Takeda cut in, now in English, was said. He turned to the door. Schedules, spreadsheets, and weeks of choreography collapsed. A thread of condensation traced down a water glass, like a clock marking time in liquid. Richard whispered to his aide, "Buy us a minute," but no one moved. Power was already walking away. At the back, Matt sat very still, the stillness of a man who knows one reflex can cost a life. He watched not the anger, but its origin, humiliation sculpted by a single word. Okinawa rose like a scar, a shouted order, misheard beneath rotor noise, a friend who never stood again. Words, then as now, were the blade no one saw until after it cut. He felt Emmy beside him. Her legs had stopped swinging. She leaned forward, small hands quiet on her lap. She did not grasp the legalese, but she understood tone the way children do. Something precious had been stepped on. She glanced at her father for a sign, fight, flight, or freeze, and met only guarded calm, and behind it, the grief that sometimes surfaced when he thought she slept. The interpreter tugged his collar. If I may clarify, Takeda lifted a hand without looking back. The gesture was gentle, final. He had chosen to remove himself from a conversation unworthy of him. His assistants followed, notebooks closing with soft thuds as they fell in behind his shadow. A few Americans half stood, unsure whether to plead or to save face. Richard chose the latter. He smoothed his tie and manufactured composure. "Let's all take a breath," he said, which meant, "Let me rewrite this later." Matt measured the sequence. Takeda would cross the threshold. The corridor would swallow him. By the time courage found a tongue, the elevator would arrive. Egos might recover. The deal would not. That was the arithmetic of pride and injury. He lowered his eyes to the notebook in Emmy's lap. The cover was frayed leather, stained from rain and oil and years of opening on cots and mess tables. Along the edge, the stitching had begun to loosen. Emmy's thumb rubbed the thread. He knew the page she favored. She traced it at night. K. Respect. The character like a small house held together by attention. Around them, a rustle of suits. A woman from compliance whispered, "Can they sue us?" Someone murmured, "Why say servitude?" The interpreter, stranded, kept talking, as if explanation could clean the floor after the blood had dried. His words foamed on a tide already going out. Takeda reached the door. The brass handle caught the light, a bright crescent. He set his hand to it. Emmy's fingers tightened on the notebook. It was instinct, like catching a falling glass. Her eyes tracked the departing figure, then flicked to the interpreter's mouth. She knew enough Japanese to hear the gap between what the Americans meant and what the room had received. She knew enough of her father's life to recognize the face he wore now. The face of a man watching his chance to repair something pass by. Matt's gaze met hers. No words. A slow inhale lifted his shoulders. He shook his head by a fraction. Not yet. The billionaire turned once more to deliver a phrase in his own language. Final, ceremonial, the closing of a door that had not yet shut. The interpreter swallowed and prepared, already failing. The room held its breath at the lip of silence, and the little girl's hand, small and steady, closed harder over the battered spine of her father's book. Quiet resolve gathered behind her bright, careful eyes. "Please, sir, do not misunderstand." A child's voice, light, unshaken, and perfectly clear in Japanese, rose through the stillness. The words rang so strangely against the marble and glass that for a moment no one could place their origin. Executives stiffened, eyes darting, wondering if an unseen aide had spoken. But when their gaze followed the sound, they froze. It came from a little girl, at the back of the room, where no one had thought to look. 8-year-old Emmy Miller had risen slightly in her chair, her small hands pressed against the table. The notebook she always carried lay open before her, kanji characters dancing across its pages. Her voice, though soft, carried the cadence of Kyoto streets, the tenderness of a grandmother's lessons whispered at dusk. "Not servitude," she said again, more firmly this time. The word means respect. Fair partnership. That is what they meant. Gasps fluttered around the conference room. A few Americans chuckled awkwardly, thinking it absurd, a child interpreting for statesmen. But those who spoke Japanese did not laugh. They heard the accuracy, the precision, the reverence in her accent. It was not the clumsy recital of a textbook. It was alive. Matt did not move at first. His heart gave a sudden lurch, a father's instinct to shield, to hush. But then his training returned, the patience of a soldier in ambush, the discipline of silence. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his broad, steady hand on Emmy's shoulder. It was not to stop her. It was to anchor her. The weight of his palm communicated what words could not. "I am here. I will bear what follows." From the far end, Takeda's step faltered. His hand was still on the brass door handle. He had been a second from leaving, from sealing the insult with finality. Now, he paused. The child's Japanese was flawless, unmistakable. He turned his head slightly, as if unwilling to believe his ears had been faithful. And then, he turned fully. The billionaire's eyes, dark as polished obsidian, fixed on Emmy. The air seemed to compress around his gaze. His assistants shifted nervously behind him, but he raised a single hand to silence them. "Who spoke?" he demanded in Japanese. The interpreter half stood, flustered. "Sir, it was—" But Takeda's gaze swept past him, already dismissing the man as irrelevant. His eyes fell again on the girl. Emmy's chin trembled, but she did not look away. She bowed slightly in her seat, her voice steady though her pulse raced. "I did, Your Excellency." Takeda studied her in silence, and then it happened. The witness effect. Beneath the chandelier's glow, Madame Ishikawa, Takeda's senior secretary, an older woman with silver hair coiled in a bun, pressed her wrinkled hand to her mouth. Her eyes glistened. She had sat through decades of negotiations, heard countless speeches, but none had moved her quite like this. For the first time in years, she felt something stir. Hope. Tears slid down her cheeks, soft and unhidden. The room noticed. The sight of Ishikawa crying punctured the cynicism that had built up in the chamber. If this seasoned woman was moved, then perhaps this moment was more than childish intrusion. Takeda's voice dropped low. "Where did you learn my language, child?" Emmy clasped her notebook tighter. "From my grandmother. She lived in Kyoto before she died. She taught me every night. She said language is not just words, but respect." A long silence followed. The executives shuffled, uncomfortable. Some frowned, whispering that this was absurd. Others leaned forward, drawn in despite themselves. Even Richard Cole, who had been busy calculating the fallout, felt a chill crawl up his spine. This was not on his script. Matt's hand pressed gently against Emmy's shoulder. He did not speak, but his presence steadied her like the keel of a ship. He felt the stares, mocking, bewildered, skeptical, but he also felt the subtle shift in the room's current. Power had begun to tilt, ever so slightly. This was the power shift moment. Takeda stepped away from the door. The brass handle clicked back into place. Each sound, the tap of his shoes on the marble, the rustle of his suit, landed like a gavel in the room's silence. He walked back toward the table, not quickly, not slowly, but with the controlled stride of a man reassessing the battlefield. "Let them sit," he said at last, his Japanese measured, deliberate. Then, in English, for the benefit of the room, "I will hear them." Shock rippled across the American side. Some looked at Matt as if seeing him for the first time. Others looked away, embarrassed at their own earlier mockery. The interpreter collapsed back into his chair, pale, irrelevant. Emmy lowered her eyes, her cheeks flushed, but Matt's hand remained, grounding her. He did not smile, did not bask in attention. His calm only deepened, like a man who had walked through fire before and knew more flames lay ahead. For the first time that day, the Glass Tower's boardroom did not belong to Richard Cole, nor to the smooth voices of the Americans. It did not even belong solely to Takeda. It belonged to a father and his child, once invisible, now impossible to ignore. "Let them sit. I will hear them." Takeda's words fell like stones into still water. The ripple was immediate and unmistakable. Every head turned, some in disbelief, others in alarm. The billionaire's command cut through layers of hierarchy, silencing murmurs, halting excuses. No one argued. No one dared. The interpreter, who only moments before held the power of translation in his trembling hands, sank lower in his chair, his pallor ashen. The spotlight had shifted, suddenly, shockingly. It now rested on Matt and Emmy. A chair scraped back at the end of the table. An assistant moved awkwardly, uncertain whether to obey or resist the order. His eyes darted to Richard Cole, who offered no rescue. Takeda's gaze held steady, sharp, immovable. Reluctantly, the assistant pulled out 2 chairs. Matt rose slowly, the motion deliberate, disciplined. His height surprised those who had dismissed him. Broad-shouldered, upright despite the years, he carried himself with the quiet bearing of a man who had once stood in uniform. He guided Emmy forward, his hand gentle on her back. She clutched her notebook tightly, her knuckles white, but her chin was lifted. The sound of their footsteps across the marble floor was unnervingly loud. They were the steps of people who had been invisible moments before, and now, impossibly, had been invited into the circle of power. As they approached the table, the Americans shifted uncomfortably. Their earlier whispers about Matt, carrying boxes, couldn't find a babysitter, seemed to echo in their ears. A few avoided his gaze, embarrassed. Others stiffened, resentment simmering beneath their professionalism. It was one thing to ignore him in the shadows. It was another to be forced to watch him take a seat beside them. Across from them, Takeda's aides stood in rigid silence. Their faces betrayed a mix of irritation and wariness, but none spoke. Their employer had spoken. His word was final. Still, they could not disguise their unease. For Takeda to allow an outsider, worse, a child, to sit at the negotiation table was an affront to protocol, to decades of rigid etiquette. And yet, no one stopped it. Matt pulled out Emmy's chair first. She sat with care, her small frame dwarfed by the vast leather seat. Her feet dangled inches from the floor, but her eyes were steady. She opened her notebook, placed it neatly before her, and folded her hands. Only then did Matt lower himself into the chair beside her. His movements were precise, measured, almost ceremonial. He knew every glance was fixed on them, every breath of the room holding judgment. But he also knew that this was no victory yet. It was only a pause, a shifting of air before the next storm. The silence stretched, taut and electric. Takeda spoke first, his English heavily accented but perfectly controlled. "You speak my language," he said, addressing Emmy, though his eyes shifted briefly to Matt. "Few Americans do." Emmy bowed her head slightly. "My grandmother taught me, sir." Madame Ishikawa, still seated a few places down, dabbed her eyes discreetly. Her voice, when it came, was soft but audible. "She speaks as though she has lived among us." A murmur ran through the Japanese delegation. Respect for Ishikawa carried weight. If she vouched for the girl, they could not dismiss her outright. Richard Cole cleared his throat, trying to regain ground. "Mr. Takeda, with all respect, we cannot allow a child to—" "Enough!" Takeda's interruption was sharp. He did not raise his voice, but it carried more force than a shout. "I will hear them!" Richard's jaw tightened, but he said no more. His eyes, however, burned into Matt, cold and calculating. This was the mini high point. The air in the room had turned completely. Moments ago, Matt was an afterthought, Emmy a distraction. Now, they were at the center of every glance, every calculation. The invisible man and his daughter had been pulled, unwillingly, yet undeniably, into the center of a storm that would decide the fate of nations and fortunes. But this shift did not bring ease. It brought tension sharper than before. The Americans feared humiliation. The Japanese worried about protocol, and Richard watched for angles of exploitation. Even Takeda himself leaned back in his chair, with the posture of a man both curious and wary, as though testing the worth of an unfamiliar blade. And Matt knew. One misstep now, one misplaced word, and they would be cast out again. This time, not just ignored, but disgraced. He placed his hand flat on the table, steady, the gesture quiet but grounding. Emmy, sensing the unspoken signal, drew in a slow breath. Her notebook lay open between them, the kanji for respect visible on the page. The chandelier above hummed faintly with the air conditioning. The city outside gleamed indifferent. Inside, history leaned forward. For the first time, Matt and his daughter were no longer shadows in the room. They were seen. And being seen, at last, was its own terrifying weight. The conference room's air remained brittle, a silence stretched taut as glass. Matt sat perfectly still, every sense heightened. Beside him, Emmy scribbled a small note in her careful handwriting, her lips moving as she rehearsed the words quietly in Japanese. He placed a hand over hers, not to silence, but to anchor. And in that fleeting gesture, memory rushed back like a flood tide, dragging him into a place he thought he had buried forever. The gleam of the Tokyo skyline faded. In its place rose the humid air of Okinawa, thick with salt and cicadas. Matt, then 23, leaned against a cinder-block wall, sweat soaking through his fatigues. The sun burned mercilessly, and his Japanese was still clumsy, but the laughter of his friend Kenji cut through every barrier. Kenji was his age, a translator assigned unofficially to bridge gaps between soldiers and locals. His easy smile made him a brother in all but blood. Kenji had taught Matt the kanji for trust, writing it carefully in the same kind of battered notebook Matt now carried. "You listen with your eyes more than your ears," Kenji had once said. "That is why you will never misunderstand the heart." But Kenji had been wrong. The day of the accident still stung. A patrol had gone wrong. Orders barked in English blurred, commands misheard, and someone mistook Kenji's urgent gestures as aggression. A shot rang out before Matt could stop it. Kenji collapsed in the dirt, his white shirt blooming red. His final word, whispered through blood, was Tomodachi, friend. Matt had knelt there, screaming, his voice drowned out by chaos, the world collapsing around that single lifeless figure. And when the dust settled, when reports were written, and the incident logged as miscommunication, Matt carried the unbearable truth. Respect, once fractured, could never be rewritten. He blinked, the conference room snapping back into focus. Emmy's hand was still beneath his, her wide eyes steady on him. She had his mother's courage, his father's stubbornness, and something uniquely her own, a way of seeing through walls. Takeda watched him closely. Perhaps the billionaire sensed that silence in Matt wasn't ignorance, but restraint, the weight of wounds no one else could see. Madame Ishikawa shifted, her gaze lingering on the old notebook at Matt's side. She, too, had known loss. And as her eyes glistened, Matt realized she understood. The Okinawa nights had been worse than the days. Matt would sit alone, the notebook open on his lap, rewriting kanji over and over. Trust, honor, respect. The words became prayer and penance, his way of holding Kenji close. One evening, an older Japanese woman had approached him outside a quiet shrine. She was Kenji's mother. She did not scream. She did not strike. She only looked at him with eyes that pierced through the marrow. Then she said softly, "Do not let my son's life be wasted by silence. Respect is not apology. Respect is action." Her words carved into him deeper than any reprimand. And from then on, Matt had vowed never to let misunderstanding define his choices again. Now, in this room of glass and power, Emmy adjusted her notebook and whispered, "Oto-san, may I?" He nodded, the same knot in his chest he'd felt years ago tightening again. Only this time, instead of watching a friend's life drain away, he was watching life spring forward. Emmy, at only 8 years old, embodied everything Kenji had taught him: curiosity, compassion, respect carried in tone as much as in words. Her voice rose, steady and clear. She spoke to Takeda in Japanese, thanking him for his patience, apologizing for the confusion, and asking that he not let a mistake steal the chance for understanding. Her words were simple, yet they rang with dignity beyond her years. The room was spellbound. Takeda's jaw unclenched. Madame Ishikawa covered her mouth with a trembling hand. The Americans shifted uneasily, their certainty shaken by a child who spoke truths their rehearsed speeches never could. As Matt listened, another image overlapped. The sight of Kenji lying in the dirt, whispering friend. The echo was almost unbearable. Yet in Emi's words, he heard Kenji's voice return, not broken, but whole. It was as if time itself had bent, delivering healing through his daughter's small frame. Respect. Not as doctrine, not as military jargon, not as empty diplomacy. Respect as a bridge across the unbridgeable. Respect as the one thing that could resurrect what death and misunderstanding had stolen. For years, Matt had carried his guilt as if it were a shadow welded to his back. But Emi's voice, innocent, unscarred, lifted it, piece by piece. When Emi finished, she bowed slightly. Takeda leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he spoke in Japanese. "You remind me of my own daughter." The words, quiet as they were, shattered the atmosphere. His aides exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to respond. For Takeda to draw a personal comparison was unheard of. Matt's throat tightened. He remembered Kenji's mother, remembered her plea that silence not be the final legacy. And now, through Emi, silence had been broken. The conference room lights hummed faintly. Outside, the Tokyo skyline burned with neon. Inside, the air was different, less brittle, more alive. Matt lowered his gaze to the notebook before him, its worn pages filled with kanji scratched by a much younger hand. He traced one character with his finger. Sankei. Respect. For the first time in decades, the word no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a bridge. He looked at Emi, who gave him the faintest smile. And in that fragile, fleeting moment, the ghosts of Okinawa finally loosened their grip. The shift in the room was subtle at first. Takeda had paused, listening to the echo of Emi's words, the weight of the air finally softening. For a moment, it felt as if a fragile bridge of understanding had been built. But bridges are delicate things, and there were those in the room who wanted them burned. Richard Cole adjusted his cufflinks with a smooth, practiced motion. His face, handsome in a sharp and sterile way, carried the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. On paper, he was part of the American delegation, an advisor, a strategist, a man who spoke in polished sentences full of reassurance. But beneath that facade lay cracks invisible to the casual observer. Cracks Matt recognized, though he had yet to name them. The interpreter, a young man in a navy suit, fidgeted with his earpiece again. His palms were slick, his forehead damp. Emi had already corrected his earlier misstep, but as the conversation resumed, Matt noticed something strange. The mistranslation hadn't been clumsy, it had been precise. A single phrase inverted, a subtle shift in tone, one that turned courtesy into insult. Matt's years in Okinawa had taught him enough to recognize deliberate distortion when he heard it. Language was fragile, but intent was sharper than any blade. He leaned slightly toward Emi, whispering, "Did you hear it?" Emi nodded, her small fingers tightening on his sleeve. "Yes, Papa. He said the opposite of what Mr. Takeda meant. It wasn't a mistake. It was sabotage." Richard's voice cut through, smooth as oil. "Perhaps we should table this discussion. Clearly, the cultural gap is insurmountable." His gaze flicked briefly to the interpreter, then to Takeda, as if planting seeds of frustration. Takeda bristled, his pride still tender from the earlier insult. The room stirred uneasily. Madame Ishikawa's brows furrowed. She, too, seemed to sense something wrong, but lacked the strength to confront it outright. Matt's chest tightened. He could almost hear Kenji's mother again. Respect is action. To remain silent now would be complicity. Matt cleared his throat, the sound startling in the tense quiet. "With respect, Mr. Takeda," he began, his voice low but firm. "May I repeat what was said? Word for word? Gasps flickered around the room. A logistics man daring to speak, cutting across the sleek cadence of corporate power brokers. Richard's eyes narrowed, the faintest crack in his charm. Takeda gestured with a hand. Speak. Matt nodded at Emmy. She rose, her small voice calm yet crystalline. In flawless Japanese, she repeated Takeda's original phrase, then translated it into English herself. Respect restored, dignity intact. The effect was seismic. Madame Ishikawa pressed a hand to her chest, tears threatening. Takeda's glare shifted, no longer aimed at offense, but at betrayal lurking in the room. Richard leaned back, forcing a chuckle. Admirable, really, that a child should take the floor, but perhaps we should leave the translations to the professionals. Emmy straightened her shoulders, fire flickering in her eyes. Professionals do not twist words to wound. The room froze. For the first time, the saboteur was named, not outright, but by implication. Richard's jaw tightened. Behind the polished exterior lay desperation. He had debts buried deep in the ledgers of his conglomerate, investors clawing at his heels, executives demanding a win at any cost. The Japanese deal, if it collapsed, would open doors for his own allies to swoop in. And if humiliation was the price, so be it. Yet, in his heart, Richard wasn't merely greedy, he was trapped. A man whose ambition had been fed by fear until corruption became survival. That was why he chose sabotage, because to him, it wasn't dishonor, it was necessity. But necessity could never excuse betrayal. Not here. Not now. Matt pulled the battered notebook from his bag, its edges frayed, kanji scrawled across the margins. He laid it open, pointing to the phrase Takeda had spoken earlier. His handwriting from years ago matched Emmy's neat script now. This is what was said, Matt explained quietly, yet every syllable carried. I learned it decades ago from a friend who taught me the value of respect. There was no insult, only honor. Takeda studied the page, his fingers brushing the faded ink. Slowly, his face hardened, then lifted toward the interpreter. Is this true? The young man faltered, sweat dripping down his temple. His lips moved, searching for lies, but Richard's eyes bore into him like steel. Trapped between fear and exposure, the interpreter stammered, Yes, I was instructed to—" He didn't finish. Richard's hand clapped his shoulder sharply, silencing him. Enough, Richard barked. This is beneath us. Let's not dramatize. But the damage was done. Everyone in the room had heard. Takeda rose to his feet, his presence filling the space like thunder. Beneath us? No. Integrity is never beneath us. His voice boomed, and his aides straightened. Fire ignited in their eyes. Richard swallowed, his charm fraying. He looked around for support, but all he found were averted gazes. The mask of the smooth negotiator had slipped, revealing the cracks beneath. Matt remained seated, Emmy at his side, both steady as stone. They had spoken not with authority, but with truth, and truth had shifted the tide. For the first time, Matt was not invisible. For the first time, Emmy was not dismissed as a child. Together, they had pierced the lie, and in that piercing, exposed the saboteur. The interpreter, pale and trembling, sat down heavily, shame etched across his face. Richard, however, forced his mask back into place, smoothing his tie. He would not crumble yet. His kind never did. He would wait, bide his time, and strike again in subtler ways. But the room no longer belonged to him. Takeda's gaze lingered on Matt and Emi, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Respect had been restored, but the battle was far from over. Beneath the polished table and bright lights, the real war had just begun. And for the first time in years, Matt felt ready. The air in the conference room seemed to congeal, thick with unspoken words. The interpreter sat in shame. Richard Cole's smile tightened into a blade, and Takeda's piercing eyes swept over the table. All waited for the man who had been invisible, Matt, to rise, to pound his fist, to seize the moment with fire. But Matt did nothing. He sat back in his chair, shoulders squared yet calm, his calloused hands folded loosely on the table. His silence carried weight. It was not the silence of fear, nor that of weakness, but of a soldier who had seen storms greater than this and knew that patience often won more ground than rage. The calm before impact. Every pair of eyes seemed to burn with curiosity, waiting for him to erupt. That was what men did in these rooms, prove themselves with raised voices, cutting words, and bold gestures. Richard smirked faintly, leaning toward a fellow delegate. "Of course he won't speak," he whispered just loudly enough. "A janitor playing soldier, pretending to matter. He'll retreat back into his shadow." The words prickled the air, baiting him, daring him to break. Emmy's small fingers pressed against her father's sleeve, but Matt simply gave her a slight nod, an unspoken assurance. He would not rise to the provocation. Not yet. The stillness unnerved them more than any outburst could. It was then that another voice, brittle with arrogance, broke the quiet. A younger American executive, his tie too tight, his laugh rehearsed, sneered across the table. "This is absurd. We are negotiating billions, and we're letting a child interrupt? What's next? Nursery rhymes written into the contract." The words sliced through the fragile calm, cutting straight at Emmy. Her cheeks flushed, but she held her chin high, eyes steady on Takeda. Matt's silence was her shield, but the sting of mockery landed nonetheless. The room shifted again. Some delegates chuckled nervously, others avoided eye contact. The old hierarchies were resurfacing, eager to bury what had just been revealed. Matt inhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the table's glossy surface. His silence grew heavier, no longer passive but deliberate, pressing against the walls like an invisible force. He knew this game. To rise too soon was to lose ground. To lash out was to confirm their prejudice. Instead, he let the silence work for him, let the mockery reveal more about its speakers than about him or Emmy. And yet, even the strongest silence can be fragile without an ally to give it voice. Madame Ishikawa, Takeda's long-serving secretary, sat near the far end of the table. She was a woman well into her 60s, her hair silver and bound in a neat bun, her hands delicate yet steady as she adjusted her glasses. For much of the meeting, she had been silent, watching like a ghost from another age. But now she rose. Her chair scraped lightly against the floor, and the room stilled. She bowed first to Takeda, then turned her gaze on the mocking executive. When she spoke, her voice trembled not from weakness, but from emotion, deep and resonant with years of loyalty. "You mock this child," she said in Japanese, her tone sharp, "because you do not understand." What she spoke was not childish interruption. It was truth, delivered with more honor than any words spoken here today. Her eyes glistened as they shifted to Emmy. In her voice, I heard the Japan I once knew. In her courage, I heard the echo of generations who valued respect above wealth. Do not dismiss her. If you do, you dismiss the very essence of what binds us. The room rippled. What had been laughter now curdled into shame. Takeda watched silently, his face unreadable, but his eyes softened briefly. Richard shifted in his seat, irritation flickering as his careful plan continued to unravel. The mocking executive coughed, shrinking slightly under the weight of Ishikawa's words. Emmy blinked quickly, her lashes damp. For a moment, she looked as though she might run to the old woman, but she stayed still, drawing strength from the acknowledgement. Matt exhaled slowly, pride tightening his chest. He remained silent, but his silence was no longer solitary. Ishikawa had given voice to what he chose to withhold, and that alliance transformed the moment. The silence returned, but now it was different. Before, it had been expectation. Now, it was reverence. A collective awareness that something deeper than business was at play, that a child's voice, an old woman's tears, and a father's steady patience had begun to shift the tectonic plates of power in the room. Matt still did not speak. He didn't need to. His restraint had become his greatest weapon. Where others expected fire, he gave stillness. Where they wanted weakness, he showed endurance. And in that endurance, others revealed themselves, both the cruel and the courageous. Takeda finally broke the silence. "Enough," he said quietly, though his voice carried like steel. His gaze swept the room. "We will proceed, but understand this. Words carry weight, and silence, too, has its power." His eyes lingered on Matt for a fraction longer, as if recognizing the rare discipline he had just displayed. Matt inclined his head slightly, a soldier's gesture of acknowledgement, while Emmy, still flushed, but steadied by Ishikawa's defense, leaned closer to her father. The mocking laughter had been silenced, and though Richard masked his frustration with a smile, deep inside, he knew. The game had changed again. The air in the boardroom had only just begun to steady after Ishikawa's quiet defense of Emmy. Delegates straightened papers, whispered to aides, sipped water as though trying to wash away the shame of their earlier mockery. But beneath the veneer of calm, a current of unease persisted. Takeda's face, as dignified as a marble statue, betrayed nothing. His silence was a blade honed sharper than anger. Matt, still watchful, read that silence the way a soldier reads a battlefield. Every pause, every twitch of muscle a possible tell. Emmy clutched his worn notebook, her fingers tracing the Japanese characters, as if they might shield her from the tension still crackling in the room. And then, the first fracture appeared. Takeda's young personal assistant, Ryo Nakamura, leaned toward him to adjust a file. For weeks, he had been invisible, a fixture at Takeda's side. Smooth hair, pressed suit, hands always folded properly. His efficiency was unquestioned, his devotion assumed. Yet Matt's soldier's instinct had tagged him from the beginning, not because of his skill, but because of the details. The faintly regional lilt in his Japanese, the cadence that hinted at Kyoto rather than Tokyo. The unnecessary habit of checking his watch every few minutes, as if waiting for a signal rather than keeping time. Small things, but soldiers live by small things. And now, as Ryo bent closer, whispering something into Takeda's ear, Matt caught it. A hesitation, a flicker in the man's eyes toward Richard Cole, a glance too quick, too nervous. It was enough. Richard Cole, seated smugly at the opposite end of the table, allowed himself the faintest smile. He tapped his pen once, twice, against the folder before him, a rhythm that spoke of secrets already known. The timing was too perfect. Whenever Takeda reached for a document, Richard seemed already prepared with a counterpoint, a preemptive rebuttal, as though he'd read the script in advance. And perhaps he had. The realization began to snake its way through Matt's mind. Information was leaking. The mistranslation incident had not been chance. The timing of Richard's smirks, the speed of his prepared arguments, it all pointed to one inside source. Ryo. The young man lowered his head quickly, too quickly, and again his eyes darted, not to Takeda, whom he served, but to Richard. And Matt, ever the silent soldier, locked his gaze upon him. Matt's stare was steady, unflinching, the kind of look men learn in combat, direct, piercing, stripped of all pretense. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He only looked. And in that gaze, Rio faltered. It was barely perceptible. A tightening of his jaw, a swallow too forced, a twitch in his hand as he adjusted the sleeve of his jacket. Yet in that moment, the mask cracked. The silence in the room amplified the tiny betrayals of body language until they roared like cannon fire in Matt's mind. He knew. And worse, Takeda knew too. For though the magnate's face remained expressionless, his fingers stilled against the armrest of his chair, no longer tapping their patient rhythm. His eyes, dark and fathomless, slid toward his assistant with a weight that could have crushed steel. But Takeda said nothing. His brilliance was his discipline. To erupt would be to reveal weakness, to show that betrayal had wounded him. Instead, he absorbed the revelation, let it settle like a stone at the bottom of a pond. Only the faintest ripple in his voice betrayed him when he said, calmly, "Proceed with the next clause." Delegates blinked in surprise. Surely he should have fired the assistant on the spot, demanded explanations, thundered with righteous fury. But Takeda was a master of timing. His silence was as deliberate as Matt's had been earlier. The room carried on, but every heart beat a little faster. Something unseen had shifted. Richard, emboldened, leaned forward with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He saw only Takeda's restraint, not the storm beneath. "Clause 19, he said smoothly, "seems problematic. Your side's wording leaves you open to liability. Perhaps you'll want to consider our alternative draft." He slid the paper forward, and again Rio's hand moved a fraction too quickly to adjust it before Takeda. Too eager. Too complicit. Matt's jaw tightened, though he remained silent. He could almost feel Emmy's questioning eyes on him, as if she too sensed that something foul was at play. He gave her a subtle nod. "Not yet," his expression said. Not yet. For the next hour, the meeting lurched forward, every word coded in tension. Matt observed quietly, each stolen glance between Rio and Richard, another nail driven into the coffin of secrecy. At one point, Rio adjusted his watch again, fingers brushing its polished face, as though confirming a signal. Matt tracked the motion with predator's focus. It was a tell, a soldier's certainty. The man was timing his leaks. Takeda's eyes flickered once more toward his assistant. Again, no words, no visible change, only silence that grew heavier, sharper. To the untrained, it looked like composure. To Matt, it was fury refined into patience. The masks were cracking, layer by layer, and then it happened. Richard leaned forward with yet another conveniently timed argument, one that relied on confidential data Takeda had mentioned only in private. The smugness in his tone was unmistakable. Matt's eyes snapped instantly to Rio. This time, he didn't merely observe. He stared, with the full weight of a soldier's silent accusation, a gaze forged in the crucible of battles where truth and survival were inseparable. Rio froze. His breath caught. His eyes betrayed him, darting once to Richard, then back to Takeda. That was enough. The truth stood naked in the silence. No one spoke it aloud, but all who were watching felt the shift. Ishikawa's lips parted, her eyes narrowing in sudden recognition. Even Emmy, small and innocent, clutched her father's notebook tighter, sensing the gravity of what had just passed. Matt said nothing. He didn't need to. His eyes had delivered the verdict. Takeda did not confront his assistant. Not here, not now. That was not his way. Instead, he closed the folder before him with measured precision, the sound of the snap echoing like a gunshot in the room. "We will adjourn for today," he said evenly. "Tomorrow, we continue." His eyes lingered on Rio a second too long, then shifted briefly, ever so briefly, to Matt. an acknowledgement, a silent salute between two men who understood the language of restraint and timing. As the delegates gathered their papers, whispering nervously, Richard smiled, as though victory was near. He did not yet realize that his victory had already begun to crumble. The leak had been exposed, not with words, but with eyes. Matt rose slowly, Emmy at his side. The little girl glanced up, whispering, "Papa, did you see it too?" Matt squeezed her hand gently. "I saw enough." And for the first time, he allowed himself the faintest smile. The battlefield had shifted again. The corridors outside the boardroom were hushed, their marble walls swallowing the faint echoes of departing delegates. Matt walked slowly, his steps heavy, as though each carried the weight of decades, of wars fought, friendships lost, and now of a battle waged not with bullets, but with mistranslations, politics, and invisible knives hidden in tailored suits. Emmy clutched his hand, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his. To any observer, she was a child, tagging along after her father. But to Matt, she was the only anchor keeping him from drifting into despair. He led her toward a quiet alcove near the garden windows, where the falling dusk painted the glass with streaks of fading gold. His shoulders slumped as he finally allowed the mask to slip. "Maybe I was wrong," he muttered, voice low, roughened by fatigue. He sank onto the bench, rubbing his temple as if trying to erase the chaos from his mind. "Maybe they'll never listen. Maybe to them, I'll always be invisible. A shadow from another war, another time." Emmy slid onto the bench beside him, watching his profile with wide, searching eyes. He shook his head slowly, staring at the garden beyond the glass. The silence stretched between them, heavy with disappointment and the bitterness of futility. "I thought if I just stayed patient, if I held my ground without lashing out, they'd see the truth. But no matter what I do," his voice broke, not with tears, but with a tired resignation that cut even deeper. "Maybe they'll never see me. Maybe they'll never see your father." The words hung there, jagged and final, but Emmy's small hand tugged at his sleeve. "I do," she said softly. He turned, startled. Her eyes shimmered in the dim light, unflinching, unwavering. "I see you, Papa. Always." Matt blinked, stunned by the simplicity and the power of her words. She was only 8, yet her voice carried the weight of absolution. Where the boardroom had dismissed him, where the powerful had looked past him, Emmy had looked directly at him and seen. For a long moment, he could only stare at her. In her gaze, he caught reflections of every sacrifice he had ever made. The nights spent in deserts and jungles, the silent prayers whispered over fallen brothers, the long walks home alone with medals that meant nothing. And here she was, declaring with a child's certainty that he was not invisible, that he was hers, and that was enough. A crack formed in the dam inside him. He exhaled, long and slow, his chest loosening for the first time in hours. His hand reached up almost without thought, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You shouldn't have to carry this," he whispered. "You're just a kid." Emmy shook her head firmly. "I'm your kid. That means I carry it with you." The innocence of her declaration struck deeper than any speech could have. His throat tightened, his vision blurred at the edges. He turned his face away, ashamed to let her see the glimmer of tears, but she caught his chin in her tiny hand and pulled him back, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Papa," she said with quiet conviction, "you don't need them to see you, because I do. And if I see you, someday, they will too." Her words were a thread, stitching together the frayed edges of his resolve. For the first time in days, he felt something return, something he thought had been buried with his comrades in Okinawa. Hope. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "You're stronger than I'll ever be." Emmy smiled, a small, radiant thing that glowed brighter than the fading sunlight outside. "That's because I have you." The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was alive, filled with unspoken promises and the quiet strength of a bond that no intrigue or betrayal could sever. Matt straightened slowly, his shoulders lifting again, no longer burdened, but steadied by purpose. He looked out at the horizon through the glass. The last rays of daylight stretched across the sky like banners, crimson and gold. It looked like a battlefield at rest, and he drew from it the courage he thought he had lost. "They'll try to break us again," he murmured. "They'll twist words, plant doubts, use every trick they know." Emmy slipped her hand back into his. "Then we'll stand together." The simplicity of her faith disarmed him more than any weapon could. He realized then that strength was not about standing alone. It was about being seen, truly seen, by even one person who mattered. And Emmy had given him that gift. A distant bell echoed from the lobby, signaling the end of the day's sessions. Delegates would gather again tomorrow, armed with new plots and sharpened words. Richard would scheme, Rio would sweat, and Takeda would test. But tonight, father and daughter sat quietly in the alcove, bound by something no translation could twist, no rival could erase. Matt looked down at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "All right, Emmy," he said softly. "We keep going. For you." She leaned her head against his arm, her voice a whisper but steady. "For us." And in that fragile, fleeting moment, surrounded by shadows of power and betrayal, Matt Miller rediscovered the strength to rise again, not as the invisible man, but as a father seen, holy and without condition, by the only witness who mattered. The world outside the hotel was still cloaked in the velvet hush of midnight. Neon lights bled through the rain-streaked windows, painting faint reflections across the glass table where Matt sat with his daughter. The boardroom battles had ended for the day, but the war inside him was far from over. The old notebook lay open before him, its edges frayed, the ink faded in places. Every page bore the ghosts of years past, Japanese phrases scrawled in his disciplined hand, fragments of dialogues, cultural nuances, idioms, and honorifics he had once painstakingly learned. He turned the pages slowly, reverently, as though flipping through scripture. Emmy, perched on the opposite chair, leaned forward with eager eyes. Her hair tumbled over her shoulder as she whispered a line, testing the cadence of ancient words. Matt corrected her gently, his voice low, carrying a tone that was half teacher, half father. This was not the frantic study of a desperate man. It was something quieter, steadier, an ember glowing patiently before it caught flame. He had nearly given up, nearly surrendered himself to invisibility. But Emmy's words, her faith, had pulled him back. And now, each stroke of his pen, each whispered correction, was a declaration. He wasn't done yet. The montage unfolded in rhythms of stillness and persistence. Matt copying kanji by lamplight, the strokes deliberate, his hand steady though scarred by time. Emmy curled beside him, mouthing the phrases until her tongue found their music. The notebook, pages spread like wings, filled with notes in 2 languages, a bridge between worlds. Matt closing his eyes, recalling Okinawa, remembering the friend he lost, the voice that once told him that respect was more powerful than rank. Every fragment of memory became fuel. Every word learned became armor. "Try it again," Matt murmured, tapping the phrase Emmy had stumbled over. She straightened, repeating it slowly, her small voice shaped by determination. He listened, nodded once, then repeated the same phrase himself, the sound deep, resonant, controlled. Side by side, their voices intertwined, his gravel, her silver, until the hotel walls seemed to hum with the rhythm of an ancient dialogue reborn. When Emmy faltered, he smiled softly, offering her patience instead of frustration. For every mistake she made, he reminded her, mistakes were proof of trying, proof of courage. At one point, she giggled, covering her mouth as she tried to repeat a tongue-twisting proverb. The sound lifted the heaviness in the room. Matt chuckled, shaking his head. "Your Japanese sounds better than mine ever did at your age." She leaned against him, her eyes bright. "That's because I have the best teacher." The words slipped into him like light into a cavern, illuminating the shadows he carried. The old notebook became more than a relic. It became a mirror of transformation. Where once it had been a record of a soldier's attempts to understand a foreign land, now it was a bond between father and daughter, a lifeline connecting past and present. Each scribble of ink was now written for Emmy as much as for himself. Matt traced his fingers along the margin where his younger self had scrawled a note in exhaustion. "Respect is earned in silence, lost in arrogance." He underlined it anew, then slid the notebook toward Emmy. She underlined it again, in her childish handwriting, beside his. Generations meeting on the same page. The hours moved like a slow tide. The city outside shifted from night into dawn, its first light washing across the skyline. Montage. Matt adjusting his posture in front of the mirror, rehearsing the quiet bow of respect, the subtlety of gestures that carried meaning beyond words. Emmy practicing intonation, her voice steady, repeating, "Please do not misunderstand," until it rang with grace and conviction. The two of them sitting on the floor, surrounded by scattered papers, translating lines back and forth, their laughter cutting through fatigue. Each frame was ordinary, yet sacred. It was not the dramatics of a warrior sharpening his blade before battle. It was subtler, like the growing strength of roots beneath soil. By sunrise, Matt rose from his chair, stretching his shoulders. His reflection in the window startled him, not because he looked younger, but because he looked alive. The slump was gone. His eyes, once dulled by defeat, now burned with focus. Emmy yawned and leaned against the table, blinking sleepily. "Papa, are we ready?" He looked at her, truly looked, and felt a swell of gratitude that nearly brought him to his knees. "We're not ready," he corrected gently. "We're becoming ready." She smiled faintly, her eyelids heavy. "Then we'll keep becoming." He bent, kissing the crown of her head, whispering a word in Japanese. "Ikiru," to live. The transformation was not loud. It was not marked by applause or grand gestures. It was the quiet solidity of a man who had rediscovered his spine. He closed the notebook, tying the frayed string around it, and placed it over his heart. The weight was no longer a burden, but a promise. Standing at the edge of the hotel balcony, dawn breaking around him, Matt inhaled deeply, letting the cool air fill his lungs. The city stirred below, unaware that a battle was about to begin. One not of armies, but of respect, of truth, of language wielded like a sword. Behind him, Emmy stirred, rubbing her eyes, whispering, "Papa." He turned, straightened his back, and smiled. It's time. And though the war ahead would test him more than any battlefield had, for the first time, Matt felt ready. Not just as a soldier, not just as a father, but as a man reborn. The grand ballroom of the Imperial Hotel glittered under a constellation of chandeliers. Every seat was filled. Executives in pressed suits, advisors with laptops glowing, interpreters whispering in hushed tones. This was the moment the entire negotiation had been building toward. The final night, the decisive conference. Matt sat quietly near the back, Emmy beside him. To the crowd, they were still outsiders, but to Takeda, who now regarded them with a guarded respect. They had become silent pillars in the storm. Matt's hands rested on the notebook, a talisman of his past and future. Emmy's small frame sat upright, unshaken, her gaze fixed on the stage. Richard Cole, the American rival, prowled near the podium with the confidence of a man who believed he had orchestrated every outcome. His smile was serpentine as he introduced a figure at his side, a polished Japanese man in a sleek gray suit, claiming the role of official interpreter. "This," Richard announced, his voice dripping with triumph, "will ensure there are no more accidental misunderstandings." Polite applause followed, though a ripple of unease moved through the Japanese delegates. Takeda's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, observing as the new interpreter bowed stiffly. Matt felt Emmy tense beside him. She whispered, "He doesn't sound right." Her instincts, sharpened by days of listening and learning, caught what others missed. The interpreter's cadence lacked authenticity, his honorifics clipped unnaturally. The meeting began. Speeches flowed, negotiations reopened, words volleyed like arrows across the room. Richard's confidence swelled with each phrase the translator delivered. But then came the crack. A Japanese delegate invoked an old proverb, spoken with gravitas. "The bamboo that bends is stronger than the oak that resists." The room stilled. It was a phrase steeped in centuries of cultural wisdom, a reminder of humility and resilience. But the interpreter faltered. His eyes darted, his voice caught, and what left his lips was a crude, literal translation. "Trees that bend break more easily than oaks." A collective intake of breath swept the chamber. The meaning had inverted entirely. What should have been a call for grace and patience became an insult. Murmurs rose. The Japanese side exchanged startled looks. Richard's jaw tightened. He masked his irritation with a thin smile, but beads of sweat glistened at his temple. Matt's gaze flicked to Emmy. Her small fists were clenched on her lap. He placed his hand over hers, steadying her, silently telling her, "Wait. The moment is coming." The silence grew heavy, threatening collapse. And then, clear as a bell, Emmy rose to her feet. Her voice carried through the cavernous ballroom. "Mina-sama, please, allow me." Heads turned sharply. Whispers hissed across the rows. "A child? Again?" Richard barked. "Sit down. This is no place for—" But Takeda raised his hand, silencing him. "Let her speak." The entire hall froze. Emmy inhaled, her eyes shimmering but steady. Then she repeated the proverb, in perfect, flowing Japanese, her young voice wrapping each syllable in reverence. She bowed slightly, then lifted her gaze to the delegates. "Respect," she said softly, switching to English so all could hear, "does not live only in words. Respect lives in how we choose to listen. My father taught me that. It was not merely translation. It was truth, spoken from the heart of a child who carried no agenda but honesty." The weight of her words fell like gentle rain, soaking through the hardened soil of pride and mistrust. Takeda's eyes glistened. His elderly secretary, Ishikawa, covered her mouth as tears welled up. For her, Emmy's voice was a living echo of the honor her generation feared was vanishing. Matt, still seated, bowed his head. He felt the tremor in his chest. Pride, humility, the ache of knowing his daughter was now his shield as much as he was hers. Richard sputtered, leaning forward. "This is absurd. She's a child, for God's sake." But his words faltered against the silence that met him. Silence heavy with reverence, not dismissal. Then it began. A soft clap from Ishikawa. Then another, from a delegate near the center. And like fire catching across dry grass, applause spread through the hall. Slow at first, then swelling into a thunderous ovation. Executives, interpreters, secretaries, even stoic guards, all on their feet, clapping for the girl who had pierced the fog of deception with nothing but sincerity. Emmy stood frozen, her cheeks flushed, her small body trembling. Matt rose and placed his hands gently on her shoulders. He bent low and whispered, "Breathe. Let it in. This moment is yours." Takeda rose from his seat, bowing deeply toward Emmy. His voice, resonant and solemn, cut through the applause. Tonight, the voice of truth did not come from power, but from purity. Let this be recorded. The applause grew louder, echoing against the high ceilings, rolling like thunder into the Tokyo night. Richard's smile collapsed. His carefully laid plan disintegrated in the face of a child's authenticity. He sank into his chair, his knuckles white on the table's edge. For the first time, he looked small. Not the wolf in the room, but a cornered fox. The fake interpreter slunk away, bowing clumsily, exposed and humiliated. Richard's empire of manipulation had cracked, not with fury, but with innocence. Matt finally stepped forward, bowing slightly to Takeda. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Emmy's words had been enough. When the applause at last softened into silence, the meeting resumed. But the air was different now. It was lighter, freer. The tension that had suffocated the room all week had lifted. Agreements were made, not through coercion, but through clarity. Respect threaded itself through each exchange. And though Emmy sat quietly again, her presence remained like a lantern glowing at the heart of the hall. By the time the gavel struck, signaling the close of the conference, the decision was clear. The partnership would proceed, with Takeda's trust secured and Richard's influence shattered. As the delegates began to disperse, Takeda approached Matt and Emmy. He looked down at the girl with eyes that had once burned with suspicion. "Your voice saved this night," he said gently. Emmy bowed, her cheeks glowing. "It wasn't just me," she replied. "It was us." Takeda's lips curved into the faintest smile, rare and profound. He turned to Matt, nodding once, a warrior's gesture of respect. Outside, the Tokyo night pulsed with neon and possibility. But inside, father and daughter knew they had already won. Not just a deal, but a recognition deeper than business. The recognition of truth carried on the smallest of voices. The ballroom had not yet recovered from the thunder of applause when silence returned, heavier and sharper than before. Delegates shifted in their chairs, their eyes darting between Richard, ashen and rigid, and the small figure of Emmy, who had spoken with the clarity that no adult in the room could match. The conference hung in suspension, every breath held, as though history itself waited for the next gesture. It was then that Takeda rose. The old man's posture was immaculate, a silhouette of dignity carved from decades of leadership. His cane, which usually steadied him, remained untouched by his side. Instead, he drew his full height, his voice cutting across the air like the strike of a temple bell. "Gentlemen," Takeda began, his tone even but resonant, "we have heard much tonight. Numbers, strategies, interpretations. But truth, real truth, is not confined to numbers or translations. It resides in the soul of those who dare to honor it." All eyes turned fully to him. Richard tried to interject, his voice strained. "Mr. Takeda, with respect." But Takeda lifted one hand, silencing him with nothing more than a gesture. Then he turned his gaze to Matt. "This man," Takeda said slowly, each syllable deliberate, "does not bear a title. He carries no corporate insignia, no official position of power. Yet he understands Japan more deeply than any in this room who claim expertise." A ripple moved across the delegates, like wind through grass. Shock, disbelief, and then, gradually, agreement. Heads nodded, lips murmured assent. Matt did not move. He sat still, Emmy's hand clutching his sleeve, his jaw firm. His silence was not weakness. It was the kind of silence that grows from the soil of conviction, a silence so steady that it became thunder in itself. Takeda continued, his eyes sharpening on Richard. "And you, Mr. Cole, who came here cloaked in ambition, chose deceit over respect. You planted a false voice in our midst, thinking you could corrupt the very essence of dialogue. In doing so, you revealed not our weakness, but your own." Richard's face reddened, his mouth opened, then closed again, like a man gasping for oxygen while sinking beneath waves. All at once, the room's attention shifted toward the shadows near the side. Takeda's personal assistant, once so reliable, so unassuming, was now trembling visibly. The murmurs grew sharper as Takeda's words shifted toward him. "You too," Takeda said, his voice sorrowful now. "I welcomed you, trusted you, believed your loyalty was woven into our fabric. But even a single loose thread can unravel a tapestry." The assistant could no longer hold his composure. He bowed deeply, forehead nearly touching the floor, his voice cracking. "Forgive me. I was weak. They offered me money, security. His confession cut like glass through the room. Delegates exchanged glances of horror, then disdain. A man who had stood so close to Takeda, betraying him for a foreign rival, it was unthinkable, yet undeniable. Richard's head snapped toward the assistant, eyes blazing. "You fool! Keep your mouth shut," he hissed, but the damage had already been done. Takeda's face did not soften. "Betrayal, Mr. Cole, has a way of rotting from the inside, and tonight, it is your house that crumbles." There, in that charged silence, the balance of the entire negotiation shifted. It was as though the weight of centuries, the discipline of samurai honor, the endurance of bamboo bending but never breaking, poured into this single moment. Matt remained silent. His silence had become the loudest voice in the room. While Richard squirmed and shouted, while the assistant wept into the floor, while Takeda delivered his verdict, Matt did nothing but sit with a gaze steady as stone. It was this silence that unsettled Richard most. He turned toward Matt, his composure unraveling. "Say something," he barked. "Don't just sit there pretending you're better than me. You're nothing, just a washed-up soldier and a child playing translator." But Matt's green eyes, unblinking, met his. The gaze was neither hateful nor triumphant. It was resolute, a mirror that reflected Richard's own desperation back at him. The hall itself seemed to decide. Whispers rose not in English, but in Japanese, the rhythm soft but unified. "He is right. The foreigner understands us. Respect, honor, trust." Richard felt the tide slipping beyond his grasp. No clever contract, no fraudulent interpreter, no bought-out assistant could restore what he had lost. Takeda raised his voice once more, final and unyielding. "Tonight, I declare this. The partnership will not be guided by those who seek to exploit, but by those who respect. And though he never asked for it, though he never claimed authority, the man who showed us what respect looks like will stand as the foundation of this alliance." A pause stretched, heavy and beautiful. Then Takeda's words cut like a blade. "Matt Miller does not need a title. He has what is greater. Honor." Gasps echoed through the chamber. The entire hall turned, this time not toward Takeda, not toward Richard, but toward Matt. He remained seated, silent. His hand shifted only to rest gently atop Emmy's shoulder, grounding her, as though telling her, "This victory is not ours to boast. It is ours to carry with humility." Richard staggered back, his face pale, sweat soaking through his collar. You can't do this," he stammered. "You need American capital. You need leverage." But his words rang hollow now. For the first time, his voice carried no authority, no echo. It was the rasp of a man stripped of power. The delegates no longer looked at him. They looked through him, as though he were already a relic of a deal that never was. The assistant remained bowed, shoulders trembling, tears staining the polished floor. His betrayal had not only destroyed him, but had become the final nail in Richard's coffin. Takeda turned to Matt once more. "You have given us more than translation. You have reminded us of what we almost lost." Still, Matt did not speak. Words were unnecessary. His silence had become the axis on which the night turned. Emmy, however, lifted her chin, her small but unwavering voice filling the gap. "My father always says respect is not something you demand. It is something you give, even when no one sees." Her words fell like petals, soft but undeniable. The delegates leaned forward, absorbing them. And in that moment, the hall felt less like a battlefield of commerce and more like a temple where something sacred had been restored. The lights shimmered across the hall. The echo of Emmy's words lingered like incense. Takeda remained standing, the embodiment of Japan's old strength fused with the clarity of new truth. Richard sat hunched, defeated. The assistant wept in shadows. And at the center, Matt, silent, unyielding, with Emmy at his side. No crown, no title, no seat of authority. Yet in that stillness, he held the room. This was poetic justice, not vengeance, not humiliation, but the restoration of balance. The reversal of power was complete. The signatures were not rushed. Ink traveled like a steady river across cream paper, each stroke a vow witnessed by glass, light, and 100 unblinking eyes. When the final page lay flat, Hiroshi Takeda capped his pen, lifted his gaze, and said simply, "Let it be recorded. We proceed." No gavel fell. The agreement rang by itself. Secretaries moved like tide. Suits exhaled. The chandeliers seemed warmer, as if the room itself believed in what had been earned, not by leverage, but by respect. Against the far wall, Richard Cole stood brittle and colorless. He did not interrupt. He had learned what silence could do. Near the door, Takeda's assistant bowed his head, hands shaking. No guards removed him. Exclusion from trust would be punishment enough. Takeda stepped to the podium. Cameras craned. The press drew close until the hush itself had weight. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in Japanese, then in English, "this partnership will be measured not only in currency, but in character. Investment will follow. Yes, billions, but bound by conditions we deem essential. Transparency in process, and humanity in impact." He let the words anchor. "These are not concessions. They are our compass." Pins scratched. Rivals listened and didn't speak. The witness effect unfolded at scale. A hall trained for noise held still by a moral sentence. Takeda continued. "We will publish procurement standards and cultural protocols. We will appoint an ethics liaison empowered to pause operations if respect is compromised. We will fund scholarships in both countries for language and mediation. If we cannot conduct business with dignity, we will not conduct it. No theatrics, no threat, only terms with teeth, offered like truth." A ripple of astonishment moved through the room. In the back row, Matt stood with Emmy, her notebook hugged to her chest like a small drum. They had not advanced toward the stage. They had remained where they began, at the margin. Only the center had moved to meet them. Takeda found them with his eyes. He did not summon them. He bowed, precise, deliberate, the angle unmistakable. A billionaire bowed to a single father and his 8-year-old child. The room absorbed it like a blessing. Flashes popped and then hesitated, as if embarrassed to intrude. Even Richard stayed mute. Some recognitions do not accept commentary. They ask to be born. Takeda straightened. "You ask who advised me," he told the reporters. "Conscience did, and those who reminded me of it." He tipped his head toward the back without names, honoring by restraint more than he could have by spectacle. "There is one final provision," he added, glancing at the page. "All translation will follow a dual review protocol, with a cultural specialist empowered to clarify intent. Words will not wound our work again." Quiet thunder. An interpreter in the corner closed his eyes. Ishikawa pressed a hand to her heart. A reporter ventured. "Why now, Mr. Takeda? Why attach humane conditions to a deal of this size?" "Because we are not only building markets," he answered. "We are building memory, and we will not remember ourselves as men who bought profit at the price of respect." Applause rose, thoughtful at first, then full, until the chandeliers trembled. It sounded older than triumph, younger than hope, the sound of a system shifting a degree toward the sun. When it faded, Emmy whispered, "Did you hear the rules?" "I heard the promise," Matt said. She nodded, content, and tucked the notebook beneath her arm, as if keeping the beat for what came next. Images multiplied, signed pages stacked like calm after a storm. Takeda beneath chandeliers, a child and a veteran in the back row. Photographs tried to contain it. The truth was larger than the frame. Richard slipped toward the exit, a shadow leaving light. No one stopped him. His absence wrote its own headline. "Ambition, unaccompanied by honor, goes nowhere worth arriving." The assistant remained, weeping without sound. Ishikawa approached, offered a linen square and a bow. Mercy without absolution. Correction without cruelty had become the new language of the room. "Let us work," Takeda concluded, leaving the podium with the same controlled dignity with which he had faced humiliation. Not denying correction, but grateful for it. The audience parted as he passed, not from fear, but to make space for a man who had just chosen the heavier path. People drifted toward the doors. A few executives approached Matt to murmur thanks. Others only met his eyes and bowed. He returned each greeting in kind. No speeches, no pose, simply the fluency of humility. Emmy matched him, bright and precise, her small bow echoing his like a rhyme. At the threshold, Takeda paused again. He faced the back, lifted his chin, and bowed once more, smaller, private. Matt returned the gesture. MI followed, earnest, exact. 3 movements, power, witness, child, aligned like constellations, and mapped a new sky. Outside, rain had polished Tokyo into lacquer. Neon climbed the wet streets like vines of fire. Inside, the hall let out a final, satisfied breath. The deal was inked. The conditions were clear. The witnesses were many. It had entered policy, entered practice, and entered memory for everyone present, including cynics and rivals. And in the quiet that followed, what remained was the simple, stubborn fact that had carried the night. Respect changes the shape of power. The city lights thinned as the car carried them beyond Tokyo's fevered heart. Skyscrapers fell away, replaced by low roofs, sleeping rice fields, and hills rising dark against the sky. Wind swept across the plain, sharp with winter's breath. It pressed through the seams of the night, rattling street signs and carrying with it the scent of rain still drying on stone. Matt walked with Emmy along a narrow road that skirted the fields. The conference hall was far behind them now, reduced to memory and newspaper columns. What lingered was the stillness that followed storms, the sense that something larger than victory had been won. Emmy's small hand nestled in his, warm against the cold, fingers closing with the simple certainty of trust. They did not hurry. Each step seemed to draw a line between worlds, the one where he had been invisible, and the one where silence had been heard louder than power. Above, the moon climbed through scattered clouds, pale as parchment. Emmy tilted her head toward it, her dark eyes shining. "Dad," she whispered, "today felt like a story, like the kind you always told me before bed. Only this time, it was real." Matt looked down at her, his face softened by the silver glow. "Stories are real when people live them," he said quietly. "We just walked through ours." She nodded, thoughtful. For a while, only the sound of gravel beneath their shoes spoke. Then she squeezed his hand tighter. "Ngon ngu ko the tai joy the gioi," she said in careful Vietnamese, her voice a child's, but bearing the weight of truth. The words hung between them, fragile and eternal. Matt slowed, stopped. He crouched to meet her eyes level with his own. Wind tugged at his coat, carried strands of his hair across his brow. "Not language, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice low but steady, carved with years and tenderness. "It isn't words that change the world. It's respect." Emmy's lips parted, her breath visible in the cold air. She studied him as if carving his face into memory, then nodded slowly, as though she understood not just the sentence, but the soul behind it. They stood like that for a moment, two silhouettes in the quiet reach of the fields, bound not by blood alone, but by the lesson forged in fire and silence. Matt rose again, and together they walked forward, the wind pressing harder now, flaring their coats like banners. In the distance, train lights flickered, sliding along steel rails toward somewhere new. Behind them, Tokyo glittered, a constellation of ambition and regret, of skyscrapers and secrets. Before them stretched only road, dark and uncertain. But theirs. Emmy spoke again, softly. "Then maybe respect is its own language." Matt's smile was small, but it carried the weight of a man remade. He nodded. "The only one everyone understands." They reached a bridge arching over a narrow river. Water moved beneath them, black and restless, carrying reflections of neon scraps tossed from the horizon. Emmy leaned over the rail, watching. "It looks like the city is trying to follow us," she said. Matt joined her, resting his hand over hers on the railing. "Let it," he said. "The world can follow if it wants. We know where we're going." The river hissed beneath, timeless and tireless. Emmy laughed softly, the sound like chimes in wind. Then she pulled her notebook from her pocket, the same she had carried into the conference hall. She opened it to a blank page, wrote one sentence with careful strokes, and tore it free. Folding it small, she pressed it into Matt's palm. He opened it by moonlight. In her neat handwriting it read, "Respect is stronger than power." His throat tightened. He closed the paper slowly, pressing it against his chest. Then, wordless, he placed it back in her hands. "Keep it," he said. "Someday, someone else will need to read it. You'll know when." She slipped it into her coat, nodded, and smiled through the chill. They resumed their walk. Each footfall seemed softer now, as if the earth itself recognized them differently. No guards, no conference rooms, no cameras, only a father and daughter, carrying truth in silence. Far behind, the world would write headlines and count investments. But here, under cold stars, what remained was the hand of respect. Small and strong, carried forward by two people who had refused to let silence be mistaken for weakness. The road curved, carrying them into shadow. Emmy lifted her head one last time toward the city lights, then looked ahead, her steps light, steady. Matt glanced down at her, his smile lingering. No more words passed between them. None were needed. The wind swelled once more, sweeping through the fields, tugging at coats and carrying their silhouettes deeper into the night. And in that silence, heavy, full, eternal, the story closed. And now, dear friends, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? share your city, your country, or even just a little hello in the comments. It always warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this journey with us, I kindly invite you to subscribe to the channel, so you'll never miss the next tale of courage, kindness, and respect. Thank you truly for spending your precious time here with me today. Your presence means more than words can say. Until we meet again, stay well and stay inspired.